familiar with the federal crop insurance program. It's been around for a couple decades. It's very well established for row crops. Might have to be something to think about here. Just another expense, something to do. This is what's called a public-private partnership. So you buy insurance from a private agent, but part of the cost is shared by the federal government. And the reason that they do that, it gets more people to participate, and it also means that for most crop insurance products or livestock insurance products, in the long term, the producer should come out ahead. We'll talk about that more. There's also some insurance products available for livestock producers, and that's why I've been spending some time on this. They're not as well understood. Participation isn't quite as high, but there's a few that have been growing for forage risk and for price risk. That's what I'm going to be talking about. So first of all, why would somebody formally insure? The most common insured by a lender, not always. Somebody farm operation, maybe they're a little leveraged. It could protect that investment. Another reason, especially on the livestock side, federal options are becoming more favorable over time. So some of these products are more affordable than they used to be. You could also think about trying to protect yourself from a catastrophe. You guys see the purple very well? Well, the big one is Ukraine, and the second biggest one is inflation. We have water, COVID, China, cyber attacks, extreme weather. There's been a lot to be nervous about for a long time. And I mean, I'd say for the past 2 years, I've been pretty worried about one thing or another. So that's another answer I hear a lot too. I want to protect myself from a black swan. I want to protect myself from something that I can't necessarily predict that could hurt my bottom line, hurt my farm and family. The two options I'm going to be talking about, there's pasture, rangeland, and forage, PRF. So I teach ag policy, and my students always complain about the acronyms. And with ag policy, with insurance, there are a fair number of acronyms. I'll try to stick just to these two. So PRF, that's forage insurance. LRP, that's price insurance, livestock risk protection. There are some other options that aren't as widely as used right now, but definitely have information available if interested. So my goal for tonight, what I hope to achieve, is go over the basics of PRF, pasture insurance, hedging, and livestock risk protection. So these are fairly complicated products. The more that I study insurance, the more I talk to people about it, the more I realize I don't know. But the good thing is that the basics are fairly simple. So I want to help everybody understand whether or not this might be something that works for your operation. I'm not trying to sell any of these. And I also want to point out areas for further study. So these are things you have to be careful about that you want to think about on your own, really sit down with an agent or someone else and talk through. So first, if you can't say something today, no one's going to listen. But so if I had to write a tweet about what PRF is, you have to have pasture hay acreage. You have to have drier conditions than usual in your area, and if all those things happen, you can get paid. And we're going to break that down to each different component. So if there's one thing you need to remember about PRF, pasture, rangeland, and forage, that's what it is. The idea is that it's going to help you when it's dry locally. So first of all, you have to have some type of pasture or hay production. This could be for perennial hay crops or for grazing. There is another product called annual forage. which is basically the same thing as PRF. It's just for anything that's grown annually for forage. I haven't gotten many requests for information on it, but do want to make people know that it's available. It actually doesn't matter what kind of livestock you have. It doesn't matter whether or not you rent or own the land. You just have to be using it. And then there's drier conditions. So I didn't say rainfall because you can use this year round, and they're measuring precipitation. That's rainfall or snow. So it can pay out in the winter, it can pay out in the summer, anytime. I might say rainfall a few times because it has less syllables than precipitation, but technically that's what it is. It has to be drier than usual. And it has to be drier than usual in your area. Anybody see this? It's always hard to know when you make a presentation what's gonna but this is a grid. So it's about 60 miles wide by 17 miles long. That sounds about right. Smaller than a county. And what happens with this product is they measure precipitation in a grid. And that's what you're insuring. So the payments you get from this have nothing to do with what happens on your pasture, on your hay ground. What it has to do with is precipitation within a grid. So if conditions are widespread, you're covered. But if you're locally within the grid, or relative to the grid, if you're locally very dry or very wet, you could have really dry conditions and not get a payout. The opposite can occur. You might be fine and still get a payout. So understanding the grid, what your grid is, what your own experience with precipitation, with rainfall is relative to the grid is a really important part of the product. And something that you just spend a little time. And there are histories of precipitation, of rainfall going back at least 20 years, all times of the year. So it is something where there's pretty good information about. So would this really worry anybody? Would you be a little bit concerned? Or you think usually what you experience would be similar? Is there any reaction to is it too big, not too bad?
There can be a pretty good variance within that grid.
Yeah.
I've seen it's too big. Yes.
It's too bad.
And where's your reporting station?
That's my next
Going on
project.
actuarial. Or is that going on popular?
It's based off the weather station. Someone asked me to get a, I need to find data on the weather station, and I want to put them on the map. That's a big issue too.
Well,
So there's, I'll go through 2 years of precipitation data, but there's good data out there where you can go and see what that looks like for you. Okay, the next part is it's less than usual. So when payments are triggered is when precipitation rainfall is less than normal. So everything gets put into an index. So 100, you can think of this as 100%. This is the historic average for rainfall or precipitation within a 2-month interval. So it's all relative to the past. So if you have an index of 75, that means rainfall is 75% of the historic average. So we're not going to be talking in inches, we're going to be talking in what? In relative terms, in percent terms, you can think of it like that. So I picked a grid in Bourbon County and pulled it out. And so this is the actual precipitation index. So if you go over to 2021, you can see that it was relatively wet early on, a little bit drier than usual in April and May. Then it was pretty good conditions again, got dry in August and September. Then it was wetter than usual, and it was pretty dry in November and December. Those numbers make sense to anybody for Bourbon County? You think about the last year. Is it pretty dry in November and December? So you're all talking to each other. Please go back 20 years. It's something that I would think if this is something that might work for you, you probably want to sit at there for a while, stare at it for a while, or talk to an agent. But you can see how well it compares to your land. Next, in this, if they get less than usual, the producer is going to decide when they get protection from PRF. And you have to cover a minimum of 4 months out of the year. Now, this part gets a little complicated because you're picking specific 2-month periods within a year where you have insurance. But I like to think the important point here is that you get to decide when you use this product for at least 4 months out of the year. Specifically, the minimum is two-month intervals. You could also cover the whole year. That's up to you. You get to pick the relative weight of each interval. So if there's a particular 2-month period that you're very concerned about, you can give it a higher weight and you'll get more protection within that period. And there are some limits on the weights there. So why do you have to weight these? Premiums and indemnities are going to be scaled by the weight. So if you pick a higher weight, there's more premium and there's more protection. So it's another area where the producer has to decide. It's an important decision. I think this one's a little bit easier to explain with some specific examples. So first of all, you might be concerned about spring and summer. So in this one, you do 50% from March to April, 40% from May to June, and 10% from July to August.
Is that saying 50%?
Yeah.
Less than normal?
Okay, yeah. This is the weights. So that's yeah. So you have to. So there's two things. We haven't talked about coverage levels yet. Coverage levels are going to get at that. We're going to talk about, and I have them coming. So coverage levels are a very important decision. And then you also have to give a weight to each interval that you pick. So what time of the year do you want to be covered? So what time of the year do you want to have a rainfall measure? And how important is that going to be for your payout? So if you're really worried about March and April, you give it a weight of 50%. Premiums are going to be higher, but if rainfall is low, you're going to get a bigger payout. July and August here, 10%. So premium's going to be relatively lower for that period. The payouts are going to be relatively low. So you can scale it to however important you think that interval is. Another example, these weren't necessarily made to match your individual conditions, just to illustrate what you do. If you're concerned about winter months, you could put all your weight in just 2 intervals. Some producers do actually insure winter months because they tend to be drier, or they have in recent years, it tends to be higher payouts. Or you could insure for all periods across the year at roughly equal weights. So that's a decision where really you would sit down with an agent and work through it. Now to the next part, when do you actually get paid? First of all, it's automatic. So rainfall is being measured and you don't have to file a claim with this. That's going to be done automatically based on how much precipitation or rainfall is measured. And when does that happen? So you asked about the coverage level. If your actual index in your interval, so what's the relative level of rainfall, is less than the coverage level that you select. So coverage level is another very important decision. That probably is going to take a little bit of time to figure out. 70 to 90%. So I'm going to give a very specific example next, but the general principle of coverage levels, higher coverage levels cost more and they pay out more. Lower coverage levels cost less and they pay out less. So,
But coverage levels is different than weight.
wait, they're two different things.
Okay.
Yes. So weight's about the magnitude of protection, and the coverage level is about whether or not you actually get a payment in the first place. So I think this is easiest to explain with this example. So first of all, if you can pick an interval, I did March or April here. So in the first row, let's say you pick 90% coverage level. This is the highest possible coverage. And then the actual precipitation is 85. So that means the precipitation is 85% of what's normal during that period. So in this case, you do get an indemnity. You are going to get paid. Let's say you picked 80% coverage level, and then you had the same actual precipitation index. You don't get paid in that case because the drop in actual rainfall wasn't big enough to go below your coverage level. The last one, let's say the 90%, but your index was 120, so that means that precipitation was more than it has been historically. There's no indemnity at any coverage level because this is a relatively wet period. So this isn't protecting against wet conditions.
So where is the weight in this?
It's not there. I have them all on one slide.
Okay.
In a little bit. That's a lot of, I'm trying to break it down a little bit. And I can give it to you all at once. So in terms of the quantity of how much, the level of the payout is going to be based on the estimate of how much returns you get from hay or pasture. So the intuition for that, K-State estimated returns for alfalfa to be about $200 per acre. So some estimates of the return from hay or just the value of grazing for your operation. And so that's based, the components of that are based on two things. First of all, there's a county average that's called the county base value. You don't get to choose this, that's the county average. Second, there's this is called a productivity factor. I'm going to skip to the next one. So the quantity of what you get paid is going to be based on some county level average estimate of the value of production for your county. It's a county base value. And then you have to select a productivity factor. So here's another percentage. And this is how the policy works. And the intuition here, what's important, is so that county base value may or may not make very much sense for you. So think about that $200 per dollar estimate. That might seem too high or too low for you. Well, you can scale it up or down to match a value that fits what you need. So there's some county averages, and then you have some flexibility with that. So we're going to put it all together now. So how are indemnities actually calculated? There's a couple moving parts here. First of all, you have to have the difference between actual precipitation and the coverage level. So was precipitation low enough? Was it lower than your coverage level? That's going to be used? And then what's the value of protection? And that's where you have your county base value and your productivity factor. And then the interval weight's gonna come into play. And that's what's gonna be used to calculate your indemnity. So if you think about the things that a producer does control that are important decisions here, what's the coverage level that you want? Productivity factor and your interval weight. So how often do you want the policy to trigger? What's the value you want it to be, and what times of the year do you want to be most important? So believe it or not, this is actually a lot less complicated than what USDA puts out. This is my interpretation of that. That's basically what you do. All the items in purple are producer decisions, and each of those is going to take a fair amount of time to figure out what you want to do. I'm going to skip the more complicated version of that for time. So we can think through an example. So this is an actual example that I use calculated on the USDA website. So let's say you have a policy at 90% coverage level for hay production. You pick different weights. So February, March, 10%, April and May, 50%, June and July, 40%. Those have to add up to 100%. Then you can look at the premiums. So that's the producer premium. Producer doesn't pay the full premium. Part of it's covered by the government. So when you have that 10% weight, your premium's only $2. For the higher weights, you have higher premiums. And part of that's reflected in the protection that the policy provides. So it's only $20 with the low weight. It's $100 with a 50% weight. So, yeah, the intervals that have higher weights, pay higher premiums, you have more protection. So what actually happened during those times? So the first interval, February to March and June, July, those are relatively wet periods. There was no indemnity. For April and May, the actual index was 82, so rainfall was 82% of normal. There's an indemnity of $9 an acre. So, in this example, the indemnity is lower than the premium. Because of the way this is designed, over time, you should get more indemnities back than you do premiums. Because you're not paying the full premium cost, but that can take a while to happen. It's in really dry years. You can think 2012, there was big payments in 2012. So PRF is used all over Kansas, relatively more in the Flint Hills and certain parts of Western Kansas. It's been going up quite a bit, so over 2 million acres now. So not a small number, but still a relatively small share of pasture in the state. Deadline's November 15th. Typically, it was December 1st this year. So this is a decision you make in the fall for the subsequent year. In terms of the management considerations, it really depends what you're, how you're using it. So I've seen costs vary from $1 to $20 per acre. If you're doing grazing and you pick the lowest coverage levels, you can get down to a couple of dollars per acre pretty easy. On the other hand, if you have hay at high coverage levels, it can get more expensive on a per acre basis. So the lower levels are going to provide more catastrophic protection, but there are a wide range of costs. And there is flexibility in that. In terms of risk reduction, so part of that is just, are you going to get, looking at the grid relative to your own experience is a big part of understanding what you can use it for risk reduction. The last point is returns. So a lot of producers, not all, especially on the crop insurance side, will look at returns. The idea is am I gonna come out ahead over time using insurance? Not everyone does it, some people do. And I would say for that, there's been some research done. And if you look at the numbers, currently there tends to be higher than more dry conditions in winter. So that's another consideration. But you might not get the same amount of protection against foresters.
Then that's not a hedge. That's not a true hedge if you're insured in the winter.
Yeah.
Because cattle actually do better in a dry weather. I mean, I had gains this year that
Yeah. Yeah.
outstanding.
Yeah, it's not. But people use it in the winter.
Yeah, because of the,
Yeah.
it's not a true hedge.
It's not a true thing. Yeah. I talked to trying to understand the relationship between rainfall and soil quality. That's a science. So PRF will protect against generally dry conditions in your area. Producers should come out ahead in the long run. That might not be much consolation right now, especially with overall cost levels that everyone's dealing with, but I do like to make you aware of it. There are a lot of things that if you think this is something that would help your operation, that there needs to be further study. So we talked about the grids. We talked about comparing the grid versus your own farm. If you have a land that overlaps two grids, you can pick your own grid. You can pick both grids. So that's something. What time of the year you want to use it, your interval selection, how high of protection you want in terms of the coverage level. So, and these are things that, crop insurance, livestock insurance agents, if they've been selling it, they should be familiar. There's a lot of tools available to producers, some insurance agents have their own, to work through each of these. But those do take some time to figure out what works. So now I'm going to switch over to hedging really quickly. How are we doing on time? Okay. So this is going to be pretty basic. It's sort of an introduction to livestock risk protection, which is very similar to hedge. The idea behind hedging is allowing to manage the risk, selling feeder cattle, fed cattle, your background. It's going to reduce risk because you're off using the futures market to offset cash positions or local markets. So one gains, the other loses. I'm going to give a specific example for this later. Generally, really big picture, high level, futures markets generally can provide stability over the long term because cash and futures prices move together and behave in a or if you're buying increases, you may be able to lock in a profit margin, so guarantee a profit margin. So that's why some people do it as well. Also, the last one, I forgot, beat the market. So if you think the futures prices aren't pricing everything, if you think prices are going to go up or down, you could try to do that. That's not something I'm personally very comfortable with. It's very hard to beat the market in the long term, but people can do that. Few key terms, this isn't all of them. So we talk about basis a lot when you talk about hedging. This would be cash minus futures price. So there's going to be a difference between the price you get locally and the futures price. So talk about basis risk. There can be cases when these don't move in the same direction. That's going to make hedging less effective. And this is reflecting transportation as well as local supply and demand. So if you have a plant locally, that could affect your cash prices. You can talk about taking a long position, going long. That's when you're selling something. Going short, That's when you're buying something. And what you're buying is a specific contract that has very specific terms. So for feeder cattle, it's 50,000 pounds. And then there's other terms, so on the size of steers, sales in different states. So specific, the key thing to note here though is the quantity. There's very specific quantities that you have, increments that you have to use when you hedge. So for feeder cattle, that's 50,000 pounds, that's 83 600-pound feeders or something very close to that.
Does anybody still take delivery of contracted feeder cattle? I have not.
Not anymore. That's
For
what I was,
20 years.
yeah. I think what I learned about in high school, they said occasionally, maybe 1% of the time, and now
It's the very few live cattle are even delivered on contract anymore. So basically, that's just a formula between your feed prices and your meat.
yeah. So, talked about settlement, no physical delivery. So what happens at the end of your futures contract, if you're selling something, you have to buy back your contract at the current price. This is negotiated cash market trade. So,
Then you get margin calls into play.
yep, definitely. That's good. That's important. So when you sell or buy back, I talked before about a gains and losses. So if you make a gain in the cash markets, you make a loss in the futures market and vice versa. This selling or buying back is what's going to bring you back to your original contract price of the futures contract. So think about it this way. So let's see, I think feeder cattle futures for October, about 182, 183 right now. If prices go up, so if you buy a futures contract, prices go up, you gain in the cash markets, you get that higher price, but you're going to lose on the futures, on your futures contract. Prices go down, you're going to gain on your futures contract, but you lose in the cash markets. So if you don't like that, if you want to benefit from prices going up, you buy an options contract. So first term strike price, you might hear that, the price of the underlying futures contract. You have to pay a premium. There's a cost for it. If you're selling something, you have a put option, you're buying the call. Why would you do this? So you pay the premium, and for that you can benefit from improving prices. But you have to pay because you get an effective price floor. I'll go through two examples of that. So if you think about the October feeder cattle futures contract, that's about 182 per hundredweight. Is there anybody here that sells in October, September? No one sell in the fall? Yeah. Thanks, Wendy. When are people selling? Winter? First of the year. So you're feeding out a little bit. Yeah. 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 So it works the same regardless of the time of year. So let's say you wanted to take that 182 and you enter a futures contract now. That's the price you get. That's the effective price you get, whether or not markets go up or down. So 182 sounds good, you take it. You don't have to worry about it. But there is something you do have to worry about. It's a margin account. So the markets are changing a lot. You have a margin account, you might get a margin call. You have to might put more money in your margin account. You might have to talk to your lender. It can get pretty stressful for some people. Some people use them a lot. Next, you could think of you're selling October feeders. And you just want to have a price floor. The current, this is actually pretty high, from what I've seen lately, but the current premium for a put option for October feeders is about $10.50 per hundredweight. So this gives you an effective price floor, 171, but that's your minimum, and you can still benefit if markets go up.
Now, do those, the call options come off earlier in the month of the contract, correct, still? Like your puts and calls usually come out toward the first of the month, your contract clears off.
There always your options bill around the 20th.
There's a
It doesn't
there's
matter whether
a
it's
lag
five
in there.
years now or if it's grand.
There's a lag in there.
Do they have short-term options? Are they offering short-term options for cattle like they do in the grain?
I think a month or two out.
Well, I mean, you can buy a month, like, you know, how they trade, grain, you'll trade, make the more, you'll trade, like, I buy an August option, or I want to buy an off month option, I can do that. Are they allowed in the cattle house?
They're available for most months. I didn't.
They're not every month though.
There's one, but
I don't know where they offer short-term cattle.
I mean, I think you can buy one for March or, I think there's 1 month where you can't. I mean, this isn't a topic, I mean, to be honest, I don't teach this topic, so
Okay.
if you are active in selling options, you're gonna be able to go deeper than this. But you can buy an option for almost any month of the year.
Well,
For
that's if
feeders.
you're gonna buy your contract, wait, you only have 10 calves, you don't need an option contract.
That's not gonna work for you.
That's not gonna work.
That's not gonna work for you. So we're gonna talk about LRP. So some key considerations. We talked about the margin account and calls for futures. That's gonna be an issue for some producers. For options, you have to pay that premium. It could be an issue. You have to pay that up front. There's commissions, you have to pay someone to do it for you. And then the contract size. So for a relatively smaller cow-calf producer, that 50,000 pounds might not work too well. So we're going to move on to LRP now. So briefly, what is LRP? What's the important thing? You have livestock and market prices are less than expected, you get paid. This is one of the relatively simpler insurance products. So first of all, you have to have livestock. So right now, that's feeder cattle, and there's different types, different weight classes. Then for fed cattle, there's also heifers and steers, and there's specific weight. So these are terribly important. They affect what target weight your contract has. It's going to have a very small effect on your premium. So these aren't going to affect whether or not a payout happens. There's also policies for hogs. I don't know if any hog producers. So there used to be available for lambs, but there's not enough price data, so they stopped offering it. So what do we mean by prices? For feeder cattle, it's based on the futures prices. For fed cattle, it's based on the AMS price. I'm going to be focusing on feeder cattle for the rest of the presentation.
I got a question.
Yes,
Everybody always talks about the AMS price.
yes,
What is the actual definition of the AMS price?
the AMS price. So
U.S. Agricultural Marketing Service.
Yeah.
I understand that. What is where are they gleaning that actual information? Is it based upon cash sales? Is it based upon future sales? Because that's what determines what your LRP pricing is every day. It's based upon that AMS price.
right, for fed cattle, not for
Right.
feeder cattle.
Right. So where are they getting
it's gonna be different for different. So for, I don't have these in my head. I did look at them for swine. I looked at LRP, recently I looked at LRP prices for swine and they use AMS. And then I was looking at the futures prices. And they were pretty close. But for these AMS prices, they're also looking at the contract prices for swine. Because so much of it is contract. My general understanding is it's typically reflective of futures markets, but they might get some other price points. So it's going to pay out when prices are less than expected. So what does that actually mean? The question here is the actual price less than what's expected. So the expected price, that's the futures price for whenever you intend to market. So that could be in a couple of months, that could be in several months. And the actual price is what's the price at that time. The difference between these two, between expected and actual, is the endorsement length. So with LRP, it's 13, the minimum is 13, the maximum is 52. So you could have a very short contract or a very long contract for LRP, depending on what how you market. So one example, if you're calving in March and you're selling meat calves in September, your expected price is the September's futures in March. So that's your best guess of what prices are going to be in March. And then you have your actual price in September. Endorsement length for these is probably going to be 26 weeks. And so the usual caveat, this is not based on local cash prices. You're protected against what happens in the futures market. So if you have a situation where your local cash prices don't always move with futures markets, that might be a concern. So luckily, I know with PRF, you had the coverage level, you had the productivity factor, interval weight. So we had a lot of different percentages. With LRP, the key thing you have to select is a coverage price. So it's much simpler. Coverage price, you can think of it as the price that if actual prices go below your coverage price, you get paid. How your coverage price is determined is at the coverage level times the futures or expected price. So your maximum coverage price is current futures price. You could also pick a lower price. And that's going to provide less protection. It's going to be a lower premium. So same principle here. So how does that work? So again, say you're calving in March, sell in September. It could be different months. It doesn't really matter. So in March, September futures are $200. Your expected price is $200 a hundredweight. So I did this example a couple weeks ago, and prices have come down a little bit. But so it happens. So first, let's say you pick the first row. You pick an LRP coverage level of 95%. On a coverage price, what that gives you is a coverage price of $190 per hundredweight. If your actual price goes below that, it's $180, you get paid. Let's say you picked a lower coverage price, $170. You're not going to get paid at that $180. It's going to take more of a price drop to trigger that. What about if you pick that 170 coverage price? If prices go up to 30, you don't get paid.
What weights are you talking about here? Is feeder calf?
You're on feeder cow right now.
I'm doing all feeder calf.
I'm like, this is like a, whatever it is, what you call it, you have like 600 to
So you pick a target.
900.
Yep. So you pick a target weight. If you can actually insure the calves before they're born, and if you do that, you can't go above 600 pounds.
People above.
Yes, did I say? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. You cannot go above 600 pounds. The other class is 600 to 900. And so you pick your target weight.
But
And
there's
you,
no futures contract under 600 pounds, your futures contract based on 750 pounds.
so that's another type of
And
basis.
but so then you have a slide. No. You have a slide.
No.
No slide.
So it's just the difference. It's the difference between your coverage price and your actual price times your target weight.
So when you're buying this,
Mhm.
your intention, let's say, it really doesn't matter whether you're buying a 600-pound gift or a 700-pound gift. And you're buying insurance to a 900-pound.
Yeah.
You've got to get that gift to that 900 pound
Right.
to make it pay, to be an actual insurance on that animal. I mean, and it has to be in whatever that time frame that you're going to build that calf from that weight to this amount of weight. Or else, really, it's not a hedge.
It's not, yeah.
It's not a hedge because you're not hedging what the weight you're selling. So,
So there is some risk there with the target weight.
Well, and isn't there some flexibility, like it says September, but is there a time span that you have to do, or does it have to be in the month? You can,
Yeah.
okay.
buy today.
Yeah. So there
Okay.
is some, and I'm gonna get to it, but you can, what you do in reality doesn't have to exactly match your contract, but there are some restrictions. You can't sell more than 60 days before. You can't sell your animals more than 60 days before the end of your endorsement period, but you never actually have to sell them at all. So there's some flexibility there.
Would you say that most of these are in backgrounded cattle that are going from the backgrounder to the point that they go to the feed spot?
You mean
Remember, this
actually,
program is mostly.
so,
Because on the
yeah.
cow camp operation,
okay,
if you're calving over a 2-month time frame, let's say you know, it's just the nature of the beast. You
Yeah.
calve over a 2-month time frame. It's so hard to get the weight
yeah,
consistent.
Yep.
Into what you're doing. Whereas if you're buying cattle or you are backgrounding cattle.
Yep.
You're buying at
Yep.
a specific way
Right.
with the intention to get them to a
Right.
specific.
right, right.
So as a cow calf producer,
Right.
you need to be gearing your program to have a very shorter window in your calving operation. You're gonna buy this before the calf is born. You either gotta be AI or you gotta be in a situation where it's synced up pretty
There's
tight.
going to be less protection.
Because you're
from
not gonna hit
this.
your targets.
Yeah,
If you,
Yeah.
you don't.
there's going to be less protection.
It's all about getting a window of when you want to sell, when you want that protection time frame to be, and meeting that or matching. I mean, you can buy any day of the week. Well, you can't buy on weekends. You can't buy-
You can buy it between 3:30 and 9:30, so you have to get an agent that doesn't care if you call them at 5 p.m. or
3:30 in the
7 a.m.
afternoon to 9:30 the next morning.
Yeah. But what I would say, if I pull the data, I don't know. I can't exactly tell what I don't know what the target weights are, but just from my experience, I talk to stockers get this, they like it because it's cheaper
Yeah.
than a put, it's great for
It's a lot
stockers,
cheaper.
they're familiar with it. And potentially useful for a cow calf
And
operation.
you can choose, you don't have to buy 50,000 pounds. worth.
Yep.
Let's say you buy 30 head of calves and you want to get them started, you can get an LRP on those calves. And
Yep.
tomorrow or Saturday, you go to the sale and you buy another 30 calves.
Yep.
You run another LRP program or insurance plan on those.
So there's no limit then that you can, it's not like a hedge where it just, you've got that huge amount that you've got to fulfill.
Right.
You can do it in smaller increments.
And it costs, it's all about the end game. All this is about the end game. You have to be looking at what the end game is. You have to understand how much the feed cost is gonna be. If I'm going to put 200 pounds on it, and it costs me $1.20 a pound to put on that, that's $240. I've already got $600 in the calf, okay, I got $840 in it, plus whatever, you can say 5%, 10%, whatever that number might be. And so let's say you've got a clear $900, then you go in here and you look at your LRP that day, and if the LRP says, hey, you can lock that in, then you write your program, you write it. Otherwise, you're at risk at whatever that level is below. Sometimes it could be greater than $900. If you might come in, your LRP might say you're gonna make $950. So boy, you're locking it in like nobody's business. You see what I mean?
If you know your cost of production, if you're familiar with goods, LRP is pretty straightforward. If you've never done it, but you're worried about prices, it's much easier to start with LRP than that.
It's just,
And
Yeah,
it's usually
time-
cheaper.
time is
Time
cheap.
you choose. But see, you're choosing the time frame, like she said, in weeks. So like I said, there's cattle, if you think they're gonna gain 2 pounds a day or pound and a half, you're choosing what your time frame is. You're putting them on the grass and just feeding them grass, it's gonna take longer than have them on silage or feed. You see what I mean? So that's where this is customizable versus a head, a direct hit or a third or a call, you have a contract month. You've got to hit that contract month, just based upon the CME.
But you can afford to go out on these, because your foot's related to your lifetime.
Well, you,
Time
the
and
cost of
volatility
time.
are what kill you on the foot. If you try to go out 6, 8 months on foot like what she can do, you're gonna be so far out of the money, it's not,
The cost of the time.
yeah, the cost of the time.
You've covered a lot of my material, so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, this is
No, no,
good. This
no.
is perfect. That's a compliment. So where is LRP being used? This is for feeder cattle. There was some enthusiasm at the beginning, 2014, 2015, when prices are high, and it's shot up in recent years. So in the past 5 years, they've increased, basically the premiums have decreased. So I think it's a combination of the premiums being more affordable and the market situation we're in. There's parts of Kansas where there's no LRP. Really relatively more use in the foothills, some areas of western. So this is what something you want to do. You can sign up anytime without buying a policy. I like to think of it like a registration process. When you want to buy it, you purchase your individual endorsement. That's just the jargon with your crop insurance, livestock insurance agent. So when do you do it? The cost of LRP can vary on a daily basis. They're based on the futures markets. You can pick policies based on when you expect to sell. That's going to give you a particular length of time or an endorsement. So you really need to know what's an acceptable cost, what's an acceptable market price, and knowing your cost of production helps, and knowing the timing that you want beforehand. So have an idea of what you want. That's something you sit down with your agent, and then if you're watching the prices, you can go ahead with it. And it's after the market's closed, so it's 3:30 to 9:30. So this is the last point here. Why would you do it compared to a hedge? It's more affordable, no margin accounts. There's no minimum or no specific. It's just however many heads you want to enroll. A little repetitive there. So there is a maximum for head of cattle. I don't know of any cow-calf operations in the state that would meet this. Maybe there are. That might be an issue for feedlots. You have to purchase it where your cattle are located. I've already made this point, but you can't sell your cattle more than 60 days before the end of your coverage period. So this might be an issue for some producers. You have to sell them all. You can cover unborn feeders. So how are we doing on time? I know, upset. Okay, we're good. Okay, we're getting near the end. I have some example of the cost here. So I did this when the futures price was almost $197 per hundredweight for September. It's gone down a little bit now, but I thought that was a good example of the volatility in the market. So when these were futures prices, you could select a coverage price that was almost at that level, all the way down to 176. And the producer premiums, at the highest level, getting up towards $6, at the lowest level, $1.50 per hundredweight. So quite a wide range of prices. I can tell you, so historically, these highest coverage levels, they can pay out half of the time. They pay out quite a bit. And when they are triggered, you get more money. So that's what the higher cost is. So if you think through this example, looking at futures prices of about $196, and let's say you pick the highest possible coverage price, what do indemnities look like? So if actual prices drop down to 160, this would be fairly catastrophic. This is a big drop. In futures prices, we don't see that very often. Your indemnity is going to be $35 per hundredweight. So 2015, there was really big payouts. When prices really go down, let's say they only go down to 180, then you get $15. Go down to 190, it's just the difference between the covered price and the actual price, you get $5. Prices go up, there's no payment. That's an example.
I know it.
Yeah, the actual price based on the settlement price, the futures price, at the end of the endorsement period. Yep. Yes. So, a small point. So the higher coverage levels are at 30. The government pays 35%. It's not as high as for crops because it's just prices. But those, so these, and actually these coverage prices are all the 35% level. They haven't been selling many of the lower ones. Probably because it's just very rare to see this kind of.
So your payout is not based on what you make at your sale barn.
No.
It's based on,
The futures market.
okay,
So that's something a producer has to be comfortable.
okay,
If they don't move together very well, that's going to be, it's not going to provide as much protection.
okay.
So if you pick that lowest coverage price, so this was when we're starting out, your expected price, your futures price is 196. You pick the lowest one of 176. The price drops to 160, you get $16 a hundredweight, but for these lower drops, you don't see a payout. So the lower coverage levels don't pay out as much, but when things do drop quite a bit, they can trigger. So to wrap up, LRP is more favorable than it used to be. If you looked at it 10 years ago and thought it's too expensive, not worth my time. The premiums are, the government pays more of the premium than they used to. It is more small producer friendly. We've been talking about that. So highest coverage policies, they do provide more protection. You're going to get very frequent indemnities, but costs actually, I think with all the volatility we've seen in the past month or so, I think I'd say that's more about $7. So they do reflect the volatility in the market as well, but the cost can go pretty high for those high coverage policies. Lowest coverage policies, you're looking at $1 or $2 per hundredweight, and they're going to provide catastrophic coverage. So I have some other materials, but I think I've taken up a lot of your time already. So I can take questions, I can talk afterwards. Yeah. So that's good. So you don't pay the premium till the end of your endorsement for LRP. So you don't have to pay it till you sell. Whereas a put, you pay up front. So I didn't have a bullet point, but that's a good, I've been hearing that more, like people like that. So you don't necessarily have to pay till you get your back check. Oh yeah. Yes, drastically. So we went from 10,000 to almost 80,000 head. And that's 2022 just starting out. So I think it's, the prices are good, it's easy to use. Not for everybody, but that's about 10% of all we use in Kansas. So, I think it's simpler, it's more affordable, probably the markets we're in right now, and I think stockers are really just gone.
When the COVID hit, the market, did they, like you couldn't sell those, you know, everything was shut down. I mean, there was no, the futures were trading, but there was no market. And you couldn't get rid of the physical.
That should not have mattered for LFP, because LFP you don't have to do it.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
I think for some endorsements in 2020, there was a discount, but not for everything. There's a like
Big variable right now, like everybody, that is.
What do you guys hearing?
About
$1.30.
corn prices.
I
I don't have an exact number in my head.
Yeah,
But I mean, I know what's happened with corn prices, but I can only imagine that's looking pretty tough.
Last week, I really, that's going to be the.
I'm gonna stick around if anyone wants to talk later. I do have some other, I've been doing articles and have some other information.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yep.
Thank all of you so much for coming. I'm really encouraged that we had this turnout. It's really great. And we would love to hear if you want to do some more of these programs. I know Wendy is the livestock specialist in at K-State there in Girard. And so if there are programs that you're interested in doing, I know she wants to get more active in our area. So if there's some programs that you'd like for her to do, I know that she'd be really interested and you might want to put it just on your paper. I'm so grateful that you guys came and took the time because I know how busy all of you are. And I really am grateful that you took the time out of your schedule to come. And I hope that if you have any questions for Jennifer, that you'll stick around and ask her. So thank you guys so much all for coming.
They want to do that LRP. See, I didn't know I can get an LRP through Frontier Credit. Oh, you have to. I wasn't sure.
Here, this is please.
Thank you.